And we want to say thanks again for joining us as we continue our study here in Psalm 119. And we're looking at this psalm. God willing, we'll cover every verse of this psalm that's all about God's Word. So far, we have made it up through 144 verses. And today we'll begin a new section, verse number 145 down to verse number 152, another section here in this psalm that's all about God's Word. And we look here in verse number 145 and we see David the psalmist, and he writes and he says, I cry out with my whole heart, hear me, O Lord, I will keep your statutes. And if we were to read all the way through here in verses 145 to 152 in this entire section, maybe you'll take just a moment and read it. It's all about prayer as David prays, and we're not exactly sure the direct nature of the situation as far as all the specific details, but he does tell us in verse number 150 here in this section. He says, they draw near who follow after wickedness, they are far from your law. And so David has some enemies who are approaching him, people that he identifies as wicked people who have no regard for God or his word or his law, no regard for his commandments. David says they are drawing near. And so David's got some trouble, it seems here. People who are perhaps trying to end his life. We understand that in his position as the king of Israel, and before that as the anointed king, he had enemies. He had people who were without from his, even from his own nation, who wanted to end his life, who wanted to do him harm. We had people seeing here in the narrative of the Old Testament about David. We do have people from other nations who were not Jews, not Israelites, who wanted to harm him. And so David had enemies, it seemed, on all sides. Of course, he did have friends who loved the Lord and loved him, but David, all through his life, it seems, had enemies, people who wanted to harm him, wicked folks. Some were Jews, Israelites, some were not. Some were from other nations, but all throughout his life, when we read these great Old Testament narrative of David's life, we see that he had enemies. And so we don't know the exact specific of this situation. Who was the enemy who was coming for him, who was trying to harm him? Who was the antagonist here? But as we look here, again studying this section in Psalm 119, verse 145 to 152, David says, they draw near who follow after wickedness. Well, somebody's approaching him. The antagonist is coming to do him harm. And so here, this section is the cry. It's a prayer of a man in distress, a man who needs God's help. And we see several things we can learn about prayer here. We'll just try to take it as an outline as we go through these videos and subsequent videos here that God willing will study in this section, verses 145 to 152. We learn something here in verse 145 about how he prayed. In verse 146, we see what he prayed. In verse 147, we can see when he prayed. In verse 148, we can see how long he prayed. He talks about praying all through the night there. And then on the basis of that he prayed, what basis did David pray with? On what basis did he pray? In verse 149, well, we can see that. And we can see something about what happened in verse 150. What was the occasion of this prayer, and where was God? In verse 151, he tells us. And then finally, he tells us how it ended up, his testimony of the prayer and all that was happening in verse 152. And so we've got a bit of an outline to help us study this today and in subsequent videos. And just today, as we look at verse 145, he says in the beginning of this section, I cry out with my whole heart, hear me, O Lord, I will keep your statutes. Interesting here, I cry out with my whole heart, he says. Well, that's how he prayed. So we understand that his prayer was not just something that he muttered as some vain repetition. We don't know, whether he was praying out loud, audibly, verbally. We don't know exactly how he did that, but we understand how he prayed in the sense of with his whole heart. And so, old pastor from many years ago, Charles Spurgeon, perhaps you've heard of him, the famous British pastor from the 1800s. He said, those who have been with the God in the closet need not fear of praying to him when they are in the furnace. And so we see David here. It seems that he knew God. He spent some time with God. And so in the midst of a trial, he has no problem saying, I cry out with my whole heart. That is really the essence of prayer, isn't it? Praying and asking God with our whole heart in faith, believing that He's there, that He hears, that He answers prayer. And so we see that He says here, "Hear me, O Lord." And so when he prays and he says, "Lord, hear me," it's not just that he's saying, "God, would you be cognizant of the sound that I make?" It goes way beyond that, doesn't it? Because we understand that God is omniscient. He knows everything. Of course, He hears everything. Every sound in the universe, things that we can't even imagine. Of course, God can hear that. He knows about that. And so this idea of David praying and saying, "Lord, hear me," this is about, God, please give me a sympathetic hearing. He's saying, I'm approaching you as your servant. You're my Father. You're my Lord. And, oh Lord, please hear me as I'm crying to you with my whole heart. We understand something about that, don't we? Perhaps you've been in this kind of a situation, in a trial, in a very desperate place where you've prayed and said, "God, please hear me, because with my whole heart, this is not just some repetitive prayer, not some prayer I'm praying out of guilt or duty, but God, I need you. I really need your help right now. And if you don't break through and help me, then I'm essentially sunk. I'm finished." And so he's saying, "God, please hear me. Give me a sympathetic hearing." And then he comes down here and he says, "I will keep your statutes." Interesting how he puts that in there at the end of the prayer, because we don't see here that he's praying without any condition. He's not saying, "God, you do this for me, and I'm not committing to do anything for you." Notice he begins the prayer here. We see at the end of verse 145, "I cry out with my whole heart, hear me, O Lord, I will keep your statutes." That's not much of a conditional phrase. He's saying, I will keep your statutes. It seems that David doesn't have this expectation that God should hear him if he is not willing to hear God. No, he says, "I do know your word. I will keep your statutes. I will hear what you have said, and I will be a doer and a hearer." And so may we have this same attitude, that we be not hearers only, but doers, as we see in the Bible in the book of James. And so we see David here saying, "God, please give me a sympathetic hearing. With my whole heart, I'm crying to you. And Lord, I'm going to be a hearer and a doer. I don't expect you to hear me if I won't hear you." May that be our prayer. May we really internalize that and understand that. And God, help us to understand more about this, more about prayer as we progress through just this section, verse 145 to 152. We hope this has been a blessing to you, that you'll continue to join us for subsequent videos here in our study of Psalm 119. God bless.